I remember very well when I learned to swim, and I remember how I was incentivized to learn to swim. I was kind of slow. I mean, most of the kids learned it when they were 3 or 4, and I was 5, and I was still depending on a life jacket or water wings or something. I wasn't swimming yet. And my parents bought or had built a little rowboat about 6 feet long, and they put it out on the dock. And they said, "This is yours, but you can't use it until you learn how to swim." I think it took me about 2 hours to learn how to swim after that. I remember I jumped off the dock and I swam into my brother Alan, and they said, "Okay, now you can use your rowboat." From my earliest memory, my name has always been Seymour, although my full name is Henry Seymour Beek. And when I got out of college and got my first job, I thought, you know, Seymour sounds kind of funny, and maybe I better start going by Henry. So I was Henry in my first job for a while. And then my work friends started intermingling with my social friends, and they found out that I was called Seymour. So the next thing you know, everybody at work is calling me Seymour. So it just didn't work. My mother's parents lived in Pasadena, and that's where she lived as a small child. And they came down here and after the pavilion had opened for a visit when she was little. So that was probably when she was 6 years old or so, something like that. And that was prior to the time my dad had ever visited here. I think he didn't visit here until a year or two later. Same deal, he came down in the red car. And I remember when he first came here, they rented a boat at the pavilion, and he and his friend rowed across what is now Balboa Island and over to the North Bay and rowed around, and they came back to the pavilion. And remember, his story was that he got back late. They rented it for 2 hours or something, and he ran over. And he was afraid he was going to have to pay extra, but the guy said, "Oh, it's okay, you're fine. Hope you had a good time." So that's my dad's first memory of the area. My grandmother's maiden name was Brewster, and her father was a well-known attorney and a judge, in fact, in Philadelphia. And so that would be my great-great-grandfather. And anyway, the Brewsters, one of them, the ancestors, came across on the passage of the Mayflower when the Mayflower came over. My mother's father started out in Philadelphia, was a lawyer, and he was originally came to California to work on some case or to work on some estate or something. And he liked it so well that he decided to stay. And he stopped being a lawyer. He bought a farm near Hueneme, near Ventura. And my mother was actually born in the farmhouse in Hueneme. And I believe both her brothers were born there too. But subsequent to that, they moved to Pasadena. And I guess so the boys could get a better education. And the boys went to high school in Pasadena. And then they moved to Berkeley. And the boys, her older brothers, both went to Cal. My mother had, you know, she had tutors and things and sort of finishing school sort of education, but she never went to a regular high school or a regular college or anything like that. But she was extremely literate. She was a very good writer and very good speller and pretty good at math too, actually. My great-grandfather, Henry Seymour Beek, came over around 1800. I don't know the exact date, but around there. And settled in New Brunswick, Canada. And then his son, Henry Seymour Beek, my grandfather, moved down to Maine. And I don't know exactly when, but it was before my father was born. My father was born in Maine in 1880. And then his dad died when he was 13 years old, 1893. And the family didn't have a lot of money, so they kind of kicked around. My dad moved in with some relatives in Chicago, and then they got moved in with some relatives in Denver, and I think that his mother moved to Denver subsequently. And then he had various jobs in the Denver area. He worked on a farm outside Denver, out on the prairies, and he was a sharecropper, a sugar beet farmer for a season in Denver. That was tough. And I don't know all the other jobs that he had, but he then got a job working for the government in the Reclamation Service in Arizona, building the Granite Reef Dam up above Phoenix. And I don't know just how long he was there, a year or two probably. And at that point, his schooling had only gone through about the 8th grade. He knew how to read and write, but he had no higher education whatsoever, no high school education. But some relatives in Pasadena, the Whites, relatives on his mother's side of the family, were doing quite well, and they offered him the opportunity to come live with them and finish school in Pasadena, and he did that. He finished school there and had a couple of years of college at what is now Caltech, a Troop Institute it was in those days. But during that time, he started coming down here. He got interested in trying to get a job, and he talked to the Collins people about working for them as a carpenter, and they said, well, you have to have your tools or to work as a carpenter. So he went to the hardware store, bought some tools, and came back and said, okay, I've got tools. So they hired him. And he helped to build the first bridge onto Balboa Island. And, but then after that, I guess Mr. Collins saw that he had some other talents, and so he made him a real estate salesman, and he started selling lots on Balboa Island for Collins. And he started doing quite well at that, and that was the end of his college career. When my dad was going to Troop Institute, he belonged to a club called the Know Me Club. And subsequently, he built a boat, a rowing canoe. It's about 18 feet long, and he named it the Know Me. And the boat was a lap-strake wooden boat. Later on, it became kind of tired, and so he had Shock make a mold from it and make a fiberglass version of it, what looks just like the old Know Me. And we still have the fiberglass boat. Really nice. It's a good rowboat. They had a big park laid out on Balboa Island. It was between Balboa and Park Avenue, and between, I think, Coral and Apolline, approximately. And they planted some eucalyptus trees there, and it was going to be a park. And my dad sold lots to people that were going to be facing the park. You know, and told them, oh, your lot on Coral here is going to be facing the park. Well, then, a few weeks later, he came down, and it turned out that no, Collins was selling the lots in the park. But some of those trees were there for years and years, and I think there's one of those eucalyptus trees in that park that's still there. I think there's just one. It would be on Apolline. My dad started going up to Sacramento, found a job in Sacramento working for the legislature about 1913, and because there wasn't much going on around here in the winter, so to supplement his income, he went up there and very part-time and worked for the state. But anyway, that job, he worked into becoming the Secretary of the Senate in 1919, I believe, and continued with that title the rest of his life. He was Secretary of the Senate until he died. But of course, the nature of the job changed because the complexity of things in Sacramento increased, and the legislature used to be in session every other year. And then, of course, later on, after World War II, they met every year, and the job was much more complicated. But he managed I don't know how he did it. He kept so many balls in the air because he was able to do that job as well as manage things here in Newport Beach, as well as to develop real estate at the same time. And by being in Sacramento so much, he learned a lot about the surrounding territory, and he found some choice real estate out in Placer County, which he developed in a subdivision called Hidden Valley. And then adjacent to that, later on, he developed another piece called Lakeview Hills. Those are lovely developments. The people that live there now just love it. When my father was going to Troop Institute in Pasadena, and in high school, he met a guy named Rene Guillou there, and they became friends. And he ended up going to Rene's house in Pasadena, and Rene had a little sister who turned out to be my mother. But the little sister was only 5 or 6 years old, just a little kid playing in the yard. So that's actually how my dad first encountered my mother, and I suppose he was in his mid-20s at that time, something like that. Years later, he stayed loosely in touch with Rene Guillou. And by that time, Rene had lived in Berkeley and had gone to school at Cal. And Rene organized a hiking trip up Mount Tamalpais and invited my dad to go. And so my dad said, sure, I'd love to. So he went. Well, his little sister also went on the hiking trip up Mount Tamalpais, and that's really how my mom and dad got acquainted. By that time, she was 16 or 17, something like that. Well, in the late teens, I don't know the exact date, probably 1918 or 1919, my dad bought the Island Boathouse, which was at the corner of Agate Avenue on the South Bayfront, where the ferry offices are right now. Ferry office and shop is located in that spot. And the Island Boathouse was there, and it was not only a boat building establishment, but it had a little apartment in the back. And to the best of my knowledge, that's where my dad lived after he bought the boathouse. And then he built boats in the front. He built rowboats. I don't know how many, but quite a few, and sold them. Then subsequently, the boathouse was moved 2 doors to the west, and then he built his real estate office and shop, which is the building's still there at the corner of Agate and South Bayfront. So then the boathouse was moved, and it was raised up higher, so it had a basement under it. My parents got married in 1920 in Berkeley. My mother's father gave them a Model T Ford for a wedding present. And they drove the Model T Ford down here to Balboa Island. And I remember years later asking my mother about that trip and what it was like. And she said, oh, well, the roads were paved part of the way. I guess it probably took them 2 full days to get down here. They came down what's now 101. It was the only way to get here. Well, the house where I grew up on the South Bayfront of Balboa Island, my parents built in 1922. And they built the pier in front of the house 2 years later, 1924. And the house is basically unchanged today. The outside of the house looks about the same. They added a room on the back of the house shortly after the house was built. They had in mind that my grandmother would come and live there. And so they built it as a duplex. The upstairs was a completely separate apartment with its own kitchen and everything, and a separate entrance. And my grandmother insisted on that. She didn't want to interfere with the operations of the family downstairs. So she was upstairs, the family was downstairs. And unfortunately, I never knew my grandmother because she passed away a couple of years before I was born. But my brothers remember her very well. Very fond memories of her. You know, I took over and moved back into the house in 1985, and since then I've done some wiring work and some plumbing work and changed a few things around, but it's still basically the same. Bart's 10 years older than I am, and Alan's 7 years older. After my dad had been selling lots on Balboa Island and been a real estate guy on Balboa Island, he branched out and he bought the property where Harbor Island is now and dredged up Harbor Island and created it, and then subdivided Harbor Island. And that was about 1930. About the same time Lido Island was created. And very advanced development at underground utilities, and he advertised as underground light wires was the way it was. They talked about it in those days. And I think the lots sold for pretty expensive. I think they sold for around $10,000. At the time of the 1933 earthquake, my mother was pregnant with me. And there was some amount of panic after the earthquake. There was the thought there might be a tsunami, a tidal wave. And so a lot of people from the island moved up to Corona del Mar or moved inland someplace to stay with friends. So my mother moved up and stayed with the Everetts at their house in Corona del Mar. And there was no tidal wave. My dad was out of town. He was in Sacramento at the time of the earthquake. And of course, they found out there'd been an earthquake, but there were no communications. He couldn't phone home and find out what was going on. So he was scared to death. So he drove home, and he saw some damage along the way, you know, when he got into Southern California. So he didn't really know that everybody was okay until he got here. And he was greatly relieved that our chimney did not fall. I remember my mother being quite proud of the fact that our chimney did not fall down. Well, I was born in 1933 in the hospital at Loma Linda, California, Seventh-day Adventist Hospital. And why my mother chose that hospital, I'm not quite sure. I know she was very fond of that hospital, and she talked highly of it, even in later years. So, and there weren't a lot of choices in those days. There weren't a whole lot of hospitals in Southern California. I know my oldest brother, Bart, was born at Huntington Hospital in Pasadena, and Alan was born at Loma Linda. And then I was born at Loma Linda. And of course, my parents lived on Balboa Island at the time. I was very popular with my brothers. I was a new toy. And I was enough younger that I wasn't really competitive with them. So yeah, they were very nice to me. But when I was growing up, we had an outdoor shower in our backyard, cold water only. And it always felt very cold. But the idea was to wash off after we'd been swimming in the bay and had sand all over us. We'd come back there and wash off in the shower. before we dried off and went in the house. We didn't have a garage by the house in those days. It was a great big backyard. And the slide was back there, and there was a swing set back there, a bar on the swing set. We had a tool bench, and several different tool benches actually, and my dad always encouraged us to do some woodworking and help repair things around the house, that kind of thing. The seawall is the original old seawall around the island, which was a lot lower than the seawall is now, and it was raised about a foot in 1937, and they built the new seawall. I can remember that being done because the construction equipment was fascinating. But at high tide, the streets are below sea level, and so you can't, when it rains, the water doesn't drain out. And they've always had a system of valves, which they would close the valves at high tide so the water didn't run in, and then when the tide would go out, they'd open the valves so the streets would drain. We had music going all the time, a lot of classical music, and my brother Alan and I were big fans of classical music, and we'd give each other record albums for Christmas and birthdays and things like that. And my mother played the violin, not in later life, but I used to hear her, she used to practice on the violin. I used to hear her when I was waking up from my nap. I can remember her playing the violin. My dad played the piano and the organ and the accordion. All self-taught. He couldn't read a note of music. He had access to an organ in a church in a little town in Colorado, and taught himself how to play the organ. And they gave him the job of being the organist on Sundays at the church. I guess he could play a few hymns. I stopped piano lessons when I was about 12 years old, and because I realized I had no talent. We made frequent trips to Little Corona and had picnic lunches and looked at the tide pools and all the animals at low tide, and I had a wonderful time down there. Well, my mother and dad both had a love of nature, which I think I inherited. I've always enjoyed marine zoology and also the biology of the mountains and the trees and so on. I learned a lot about animals and bivalves and fish and stuff walking around down there. There was a big parade in 1936 when the harbor opened. But look at the boats all decorated there. Drift ship flags up and so on. I remember there was a big heat wave right before the hurricane, and I mean really hot, like over 100 degrees here at night. And I remember that. And I remember my mother talking about it, getting a thermometer and saying, "My God, it's 100 degrees," and it was 10 o'clock at night or something like that. It was in September of 1939. A hurricane that came up from Baja California to California. By the time it got here, it was rated as a tropical storm. It wasn't really a hurricane. And I think the winds blew as hard as 60 miles an hour at times. So it was nothing to be taken lightly. And a lot of rain, surf got huge, and several boats were in trouble. One of them was the Paragon, which was a 100-plus foot yacht that belonged to William Bartholomew. And they came in and tried to get into the harbor, and there were big breaking waves, and they broached and they hit the east jetty, put a hole in the boat, and they came on into the harbor, but the pumps couldn't keep up with it. The boat sunk right about off M Street in Balboa. And I can remember going down there and seeing it. You know, half of the boat was sticking out of the water, half of it was underwater. And my father was out in that storm too. He'd been at Santa Cruz Island. And he got hit by the storm out off Santa Monica Bay, and he went into Santa Monica and got a mooring, and the boat stayed there overnight. He went ashore, and then he came back after the wind had died down and came on home. So he never really had any problem. He was on his old original Vamos, which was built about 1926, I believe. 30 feet long, twin screw, and the hull was designed by Dare Long, who was a well-known naval architect. The first time I went to Catalina Island, I remember fairly well because I really got very seasick. This would have been about 1939, I guess. It was my first trip over there. And we had some mechanical difficulties, I remember, and we had to get things fixed when we were in Avalon so that we could make it home. And I didn't have a whole lot of fun, but I did have the experience of going to Catalina. They had a diving tank that was just a helmet, and then they had a pump that pumped air into the helmet, a hand pump that pumped air into the helmet. Well, my first trip there after the war, which was right after they opened the harbor, and we were able to go over there. And we went to Moonstone, I remember, and I went ashore, and there was all kinds of junk on the beach, mostly related to war maneuvers, you know, big ammunition crates and tanks and boxes and big huge food cans and things like that. It was just a mess. Somebody cleaned it up subsequently. I think the name Beacon Bay was kind of a play on our family name of Beek, but the beacon theme was used in Beacon Bay. The lighthouses were like beacons, and there was a lighthouse on every pier also in the shape of a lighthouse. I was homeschooled until the second grade, and I started at Newport Beach Grammar School, now called Newport Elementary, in the second grade. And I went there through the 8th grade and graduated from the 8th grade there, and then went directly to Newport Harbor High, which was 4 years. There was no Horace Ensign then, no middle schools. And the grammar school was a little on the rudimentary side. The same building that's there now, very nice structure. But the playground left a lot to be desired. It was just dirt out on the beach. Somebody dumped some gravel, I guess, so there were a lot of little rocks. It wasn't good for tackle football, but it was a nice location. And we had good school bus service. You could get there on the bus pick you up on Balboa Island and drive you around and get there. But that took quite a while, so when I got to be a little older, I started riding my bike to school. I could take the ferry and ride my bike, and sometimes there were big drifts of sand on the ocean front that you couldn't get through, so you couldn't ride the ocean front. You have to ride up Central Avenue, now Balboa Boulevard. But anyway, it was great. Had a great time there. The war started when I was in the 3rd grade. That changed things around a little bit. There was a great influx of people into this whole area. You know, the Santa Ana Army Air Base opened, El Toro opened, and so all of a sudden there was a big demand for school rooms as well as housing. And so they didn't have enough schoolrooms at our grammar school, but the high school had rooms available. So in the 5th grade, my class went to school at Newport Harbor High School, which was kind of different because we got to use their athletic fields and their gym and all those things. So it was kind of good. It was neat for us. I think there were just 2 years. I think the year after me, they went to Newport Harbor in the 5th grade also. Then we went back to the beach to the 6th grade. Well, during World War II, we had what we called a dim out down here at the beach. Everybody was supposed to pull their drapes. You didn't have to have your lights out. It wasn't the same as a blackout, which you couldn't have your lights on, or you had to have, black paper over the windows or something. And they painted the street lights so they wouldn't shine up. They'd only shine down, and couldn't use your car headlights anywhere near the ocean. It was about 2 miles inland was where you could turn on your headlights. I remember right by where the Santa Ana Country Club is, if you're going up Newport Boulevard, there was a sign that allowed you to turn your headlights on at that point. People drove around with just their parking lights. So it was, and they had to drive very slowly. There was, I think, a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit during the war to try to save gas. Whenever there was an air raid warning, there was a blackout. And if the sirens went off and there was an air raid warning, then you had to turn everything off. That was, but that only happened 2 or 3 times, as I recall. A lot of things were rationed. Shoes were rationed, and sugar was rationed, meat was rationed. Now, the rations were generous enough that people were not going to starve to death, but it was a little different. I can remember waiting a long time to get a pair of shoes, for example, and waited forever to get a baseball mitt and forever to get a soccer ball. I don't think I ever got the soccer ball. I think each family got a ration book and had little coupons for one thing and another, yeah. And then gasoline, everybody had a sticker on their windshield, and you were an A, B, or a C. And the A was the basic, which at one time went clear down to like 4 gallons a week, I think. And later it eased up. And the B was more generous, and you got a B sticker if you had justification, if you had to commute to work or something. And then the C sticker was unlimited. You could get as much gas as you want. My dad had a C sticker. My mother had an A sticker, and she wouldn't participate in any more than her ration. Well, Collins Island, the original house there was built by Collins, of course, the developer of Balboa Island. We call it the Collins Castle, this kind of, different kind of architecture and so on. Then James Cagney bought it sometime in the 30s. I don't know who owned it in the interim, but Cagney, when we called it Cagney's Castle at one point, Cagney Island. And then World War II, the Coast Guard requisitioned it. They whisked off all the Japanese and put them in internment camps. And I only knew one Japanese person, and it was a guy named Soto. And Mr. Soto owned a curio shop over in the Balboa. It was on Main Street in Balboa. And I can remember going there with my mother when we were little, and it smelled very funny. And I found out later, of course, he was burning incense, and that was the smell in Soto's shop. But Soto was a very nice guy, was always very kind to me, gave me little trinkets and things, and it was really a tragedy when he got hauled off. My dad corresponded with him during the war. He went off to Phoenix, to a camp near Phoenix, and he said he was well treated, everything was fine, but he wasn't back in his shop. Right after the war started, up in the vicinity of Newport Harbor High School, there was a big strawberry field, and the Japanese farmers ran it, and they had taken them away, and we all went up there and picked strawberries because nobody else was going to pick them. We felt kind of guilty about it, but they were just going to die if we didn't pick them. Well, things were a lot different during World War II. You know, activities were cut way back. You know, people couldn't travel as much because there was gas rationing and there was food rationing, and nobody was starving to death, but it changed everybody's lifestyle. So as the war wound down, things got easier and easier, and toward the end, and finally the end of the war, well, of course, everybody was delighted. There were big celebrations, and it was wonderful when the war was over because all those restrictions got lifted. She lived here in I guess it's called the White Swan, at the corner of Pearl and South Bayfront. And she lived there until she died, but she was there, I can remember when I was in high school, I knew who she was and would say hello to her, you know. She and my dad had kind of a little thing going because she got very upset when he made a lot of noise here with the maintenance of the ferry boats, and when they used to put tar on the barges that float the ferry dock, and when they had that molten tar, it gave off a smell. It's the same smell you get when somebody's doing a roof now. And I kind of like the smell, but Jessie didn't like that smell at all, and she used to complain about it. So my dad was always giving her gifts to mollify her, keep her quiet. Well, my first job was setting pins in a bowling alley that was located in the Balboa Pavilion. The upstairs of the pavilion had 9 lanes, and I went to work there for, it was 9 cents a game. You got paid. But I was only 11 years old or so at that time, so I didn't work a lot of hours, but I did work there. Oh, the sound of the pins in the bowling alley, that was a sound I grew up with, and I never questioned it. I didn't know what it was when I was a little kid. It was just a sound I heard all the time. And then finally, when I was, I suppose, 6 or 7 years old, I went over there and saw the bowling alley and saw what was making that noise. Yeah, it was pretty noisy. And my next job was working on the ferry, which I did in the summers in high school and college. In 1919, my dad was busy trying to sell lots on Balboa Island, and he had the island boathouse, and he built some boats, actually rowboats that he built himself, and sold them. And then along came an opportunity. The ferry service was not very good. People were complaining about it, and the city wanted a new ferry contractor. So my dad got the contract to operate the ferry because he had a boat that was ready to go, which was an 18-foot rowboat with an outboard on it called the Ark. And of course, there wasn't a lot of demand in those days. Only a handful of people lived on the island. So it was kind of by appointment. You could call up and get a ride across the bay. But the demand for service increased pretty fast after that, and then he bought a little larger boat with an inboard called the Islander. And the Islander was an open boat, but he put a canopy on the top of it. Then there was a demand for, more of a demand for passengers, and so he built a boat called the Fat Ferry in 1920, which held 20 passengers. And then subsequent to that, 1922, they built the first auto ferry, which held 2 cars. It was called the Joker. And then there was an evolution of ferry boats, 3-car ferries, and the 2-car ferry was lengthened to be a 3-car ferry. The little white building was a waiting room for passengers that were going to take the ferry, keep them out of the rain, if it ever rained. And the 3 ferries we have now are all built in the 1950s by a guy called Evan Jones, who really ran the ferry business for many years for my dad. And Evan Jones was, until he retired, which was about 1969 or 70, he ran the ferry business. My dad didn't really have to do much in connection with it. And subsequent to that, we had another manager named Bob Snyder, who was also a pretty full-time, complete general manager for the ferry until he became ill in the 1990s. And by that time, I'd retired from Ford Aerospace, and so I had time on my hands, so I became the general manager at the ferry, and have been ever since. Well, my dad, there was a dock always in front of the boathouse at 406 South Bayfront, and then he put in tanks that were right on the just inland from the bayfront sidewalk, there was a big concrete box that had the fuel tanks inside it, and they provided the fuel for the fuel dock out there, which opened in 1937 as a Shell dock, and then Shell, I believe, took it over and leased it from my parents, and they actually operated the dock for a long time with their own manager. It was a Shell dock until the mid 70s. Then Shell decided they didn't want to be in the marine fuel business anymore, so they didn't renew the lease. So then we took it over ourselves, and we leased it to a guy named Bob Bisbee, who got the Union 76 label on it. So it became a Unocal station. And then after we terminated Bisbee's lease, which was about 1990, and we decided to run it ourselves. And about that same time, or probably mid-90s, Unocal decided they didn't want to be in the marine fuel business anymore. So we just branded it ourselves as Island Marine Fuel, and now it's got the ValveTech brand on it. ValveTech is a company that makes additives for diesel and gasoline, which enhance the performance and so on. And so now it's a ValveTech station. And my son David took over as the manager in 2000 and has been the manager ever since. Done a great job. The flagpole was erected in 1919, right next to the ferry building. The ferry crew always took care of that flagpole. The ferry people raised the flag and lowered the flag and maintained the pole for years and years and years. And in the early 90s, I noticed that there was some dry rot around the bottom of the pole, some fissures and stuff, and it looked a little, little scary to me. So I started talking to the city people about it, and they said, "Oh, that's your problem." And I said, "Well, no, I think it's your problem. It's it's city property, and maybe you better take a look at it. Maybe have your experts take some core samples or something." So they said, "Okay, well, we'll just take it down." So they came down with some heavy equipment, and they chopped it down, and they got down to about the last 10 feet of it. And they had a great big backhoe, I remember, and there was about 10 feet of the flagpole still sticking up. And they banged this big heavy backhoe into it, and they could not knock it down. It was still pretty strong. I have a piece of that flagpole in my house. I still have one of the flags from it, yeah. Huge flag. Well, in the early 20s, my father observed that there were a lot of kids on Balboa Island in the summer with not much to do, and they just hung around, and anything he was doing, working on a boat or anything like that, they'd come around and watch him. And so he suggested that they get organized and form a club, and so he sort of founded the Balboa Island Yacht Club at that time. And it's still going ever since. It wasn't very large in those days, just probably a handful of kids, 20, 30 kids, something like that. But my brothers were active in it. I was active in it as I was growing up. We were all Commodores of the Balboa Island Yacht Club. And today well, we limit it to 220 members now because it's just out of sight. We don't have the facilities to handle any more members than that. And so it's pretty close to full every summer now. Of course, my mother also was kind of the mentor of the BIYC, Balboa Island Yacht Club. My dad actually founded it, but she nurtured it along for all those years, and their activities were on her pier, and she helped with the picnics and the administration and gave advice, and was really the supporter of the Balboa Island Yacht Club. I had to be a member of BIYC because my brothers were in the BIYC, and it was just expected of me. So of course I was in the BIYC. I don't remember exactly, probably I was 4 or 5 or 6 or something like that when I joined. And so I was very active in it, competed in all of the events until I was about 15 years old. When I was 15 years old, I won the championship, and so I decided it was time to retire, so I didn't compete anymore after that. Well, the BIYC clubhouse was when I was growing up, was in between what's now the ferry office and the boathouse. There was a little covered area out there with a brick barbecue pit and chimney, and the BIYC used to meet there when I was first a member. That vessel was called the Calpania, and it's a World War II subchaser that my dad bought after the war, Navy surplus. I think they only paid about $10,000 for it. And, you know, the Navy was kind of giving things away in those days. And they got a lot of spare parts and everything else along with it. And they turned it into a shark fishing boat. And the idea was to go down off Central America as far as Panama, catch sharks, cut their livers out, bring the livers home, and then sell them to the vitamin manufacturers that made vitamin pills out of shark livers. Vitamin D, I think it was. The venture was a lot of fun for my dad and his buddies, but it was not profitable. And I got several nice trips on that boat. Here we went up Santa Cruz Island on it one time. Couldn't afford to keep it forever, so he finally got rid of it. What's now called Beek's Place was originally one of those railroad sections that the government gave the railroads as an incentive to build the tracks into the west. And I don't know who the original owners were, but my dad bought it. It's a square mile, 640 acres, sometime in the 20s, and it was just a few dollars an acre. He didn't pay that much for it. I don't know exactly, but it was like maybe $3 or $4 an acre, something like that. And his vision was to subdivide it and sell off mountain cabin sites to people. Well, that was not a success. I mean, he only sold 2 or 3 of those sites, and people did not flock to the Santa Ana Mountains to build their cabins. But in the meantime, he became fascinated with pine trees, and so he planted hundreds, probably thousands of pine trees up there, and then he built an irrigation system to water them. The irrigation system consisted of improving a spring way down in a canyon and putting in a pump to pump the water up. And to store the water, he originally had a couple of cisterns, but then he bought the tank that was the water supply for Balboa Island that was, you see in the old pictures up on a tower. And he disassembled that tank. It was a redwood tank made with, you know, numerous staves and then steel bands that went all the way around to hold the staves together. And he numbered the staves and trucked it up to the mountain place and reassembled it on his property up there, up on a hill above the cabin. And it held 20,000 gallons. I remember he telling me that. And they reassembled it, and it functioned for years as a water supply. It eventually came to its end in the 60s when the firefighters pumped all the water out of it to fight a fire up there. And without water, it dried out and it crumbled. So we never put it back together. That was the end of it. But by that time, we had several large cisterns to hold water, so we didn't really need the tank. So my dad was a nutcase on that mountain place. Every chance he got, he'd go up there and he'd plant trees and he'd make improvements, and he just loved it. And so I did too. As a little kid, I had a great time going up there with him. And up until the end, he would still, when he'd come to Southern California, he'd want to go up to he called it the mountain. And we didn't call it Beek's Place in those days. It was just the mountain. And we'd go up to the mountain and often spent the night in the cabin and had lots of adventures up there and helped him with lots of building projects. So I learned a lot by going to the mountain with my dad. And that was a little car that my dad had built for use up there. That was before you had ATVs for sale. Sort of an advanced version of an ATV, and it only went about 15 miles an hour, but I learned how to drive that thing when I was about 8 or 9 years old. Later on, it became more accessible, and more people started going up there, and including bad people. And everything was vandalized. The cabin was destroyed, all the infrastructure. They stole the wiring from the electrical system. They stole the wiring that went down to the pump, and it just became too big a problem. In order to maintain it, we had to have a full-time caretaker up there, and we weren't prepared to do that. So the whole place just kind of went to pot. But it's become a very popular destination for mountain bikers, and people ride to Beek's place. That's a big destination. If you know anybody that'd like to buy 640 acres of the Santa Ana Mountains, let me know. When I was a teenager, or even before that, one of our great daytime adventures would be to go to Big Corona and go body surfing. And so if we didn't get a ride, which often we didn't, we would walk all the way down to the corner of the little island across from the Balboa Yacht Club, and we'd swim across, holding our beach towels up out of the water as we swam across. And then we were supposed to hitchhike. Of course, we tried to hitchhike. If we didn't get a ride, we'd just walk all the way down the beach, down where Bayside Drive goes down to Carnation Cove, and then walk up the hill and go over to Big Corona and spend the day there. Those were wonderful days. And but you could get a hamburger for about 35 cents or something like that. And you could get enough change in the little pocket in your swimsuit to get you through the day. Well, a guy named Jim Ibbotson, Jim Ibbotson and his brother Bob, well, the whole family moved here right after the war. Well, I think probably 1947. And that changed my life because Jim became a very good friend, and so was Bob. But Jim is the type that liked to take chances. He was a big risk taker, and he was a very good athlete, and he liked to do tricks and things, and if you didn't do the same trick he did, you were a chicken, So that's how I got lured into diving off the pavilion. Jim dove off the pavilion, so I had to dive off the pavilion. We did it a couple of times, actually. And we also dove off all the bridges in Newport Bay. That was the deal. You had to dive, no jumping. Well, when I was a teenager, we discovered that we could jump off the seawall onto a life raft and get pretty good spring off the life raft, so we started doing a little tumbling act there. That was Jim Ibbotson, Bob Ibbotson, Steve Pridham, John Greenleaf, and probably some others. But we had a lot of fun doing that. Well, we called it Easter week when I was involved with it, and it was the week before Easter always, because all the schools got out that week. And Balboa Island turned into a madhouse during that week. There were kids all over the place, and of course the kids loved it. I had a lot of fun Easter week. It was great. I don't think it was so good for the residents, but we had a lot of fun, and people came from all over the place and rented houses here, and there were houses full of girls from El Monte and San Marino and all over the place. So we locals really enjoyed it. Then Newport Harbor, I started in 1947 after I graduated from the 8th grade, and I had probably 600 or 700 students. It hit 1,000 students my senior year for the first time. And of course, Newport Harbor High School took in a vast area. It took the whole area, Huntington Beach to Laguna Inland to Santa Ana. That whole area went to Newport Harbor. So we had a lot of farm kids from Costa Mesa, and some fishermen's kids from West Newport, and a great smattering of kids. Al Irwin, who was our high school football coach at that time, also took on the job of being swimming coach when we got a pool. And the year before we had the pool, I remember he lined us up at gym class, and he said, we're going to have a swimming pool next year, and we can swim in the league meet this year if we want to, any of you guys think you know how to swim well enough to be in the league meet? I said, well, yeah, maybe, you know. I'd hardly ever swum in a pool in my life. So we had a couple of practices in the Huntington Beach pool at Huntington Beach High School. And he had to show me how to do a turn at the end of the pool. I didn't know what to do when I got to the end of the pool, to turn around and swim the other way. So Al showed me how to do that, and we ended up winning the C division in the league, which those days they had A's, B's, and C's. A was big kids, B's middle-sized kids, C's little kids. Anyway, we won the Sunset League, which was kind of neat since we didn't even have a swimming pool. So they built a swimming pool the summer after my sophomore year. So my junior and senior year, we had a swimming pool. So that changed my athletic career quite a bit. Before that, I was out for track, and I barely got my letter. Wasn't particularly good. I was a high jumper, and but in swimming, I excelled. So that made my high school athletic career. My mother came to a lot of our meets and photographed it. Oh, I went to the football games at Newport Harbor, of course. I didn't play football. I wasn't big enough or fast enough. But I was a fan of the football players, and so a lot of them were friends of mine, of course. And so, yeah, Raleigh was a friend of mine from just about the time he moved here. I remember meeting him. I don't remember where I met, probably at the Balboa Yacht Club that I met Raleigh first. And no, we were friends always. Did a lot of stuff together. But it was a good school. We had great teachers there. I still remember a lot of them. They were good. They were dedicated, good people. So it was a good place to go to school. Beek Hall was built after I was there, probably 5 years or so. It was probably built in the mid-50s. I don't know exactly. It was Beek Hall because my dad had been on the board of trustees there for many years. And Judge Dodge had been on the board of trustees too, and they named a building after Judge Dodge, Dodge Hall. And same way with Robbins. I believe there's a Robbins building because he had been a long-time board member too. Well, of course, I grew up body surfing. I mean, almost as soon as I learned to swim, I started to body surf. We'd make excursions to Corona del Mar. Big Corona was the big place to body surf, but we also body surfed over on the peninsula and various things. But I didn't do any board surfing until I got to college. And my freshman year in college, I met another guy who was very enthusiastic about learning to surf, so we jointly bought a surfboard together for $30. We each put in $15 and bought this surfboard. I wish we still had it because it'd be worth a lot of money now. It was a classic. It was called a Simmons Concave, and Simmons Concaves are highly collectible now. Anyway, we learned to surf, and then we started making boards ourselves to surf. Most people made their own boards in those days, although there were surfboard makers. But so we made our own boards, and I did a lot of surfing when I was in college and shortly thereafter. It was a lot different then. The surfing spots along here weren't nearly as crowded as they are now. And we'd go places like Outer Trestle, and 3 or 4 of us would go there. We'd be the only people there surfing. It was just wonderful. The Christmas boat parade, one of my favorite subjects. The Chamber of Commerce just loves to tell lies about it. They talk about how it's been going on for 100 and some years. No, actually, the Christmas boat parade started in 1947. I can remember where it started. I lived on the bayfront at that time. There weren't any Christmas boat parades before that. There were other boat parades, though, and that's where the confusion comes in, I think. There was the Tournament of Lights started in the early 20s. I don't know the exact date. My father was very active in promoting and organizing the Tournament of Lights. And it was a summer event, one night only, midsummer. It was girls in bathing suits on the floats and things like that. And it was great. I remember it as a little kid. the Tournament of Lights, of course, shut down during World War II, and there were 3 tournaments after World War II, in 1946, 1947, and 1949. And the reason there wasn't one in 1948 was because the local authorities, the fire marshal and so on, thought there were too many people, it was too hazardous, it was, you know, all of those good reasons, which nobody seems to pay any attention to now because we get about 1 million people in town for the Christmas Boat Parade. But anyway, the last one was 49. So there was a little overlap. The Christmas Boat Parade actually started 47, but it was just a few boats, very rudimentary. And then sometime later, probably 1950 or thereabouts, we started using the ferry boat for the lead boat. They'd put a Christmas tree, a simulated Christmas tree on the ferry boat. And that went on for 20-some years until the point that the ferry traffic, the demand for ferry travel got so great that we needed the extra ferry boat. And so then other boats took over the job as the lead boat. In 1953, a fire started in the little house just west of the Island Boathouse, which I believe was the original house on Balboa Island. Anyway, a fire started in that house. The fire immediately spread to the boathouse. The boathouse was all full of paint and paint thinner and lube oil and things that just went up like crazy in the fire. So it was a big conflagration. And fire engines from all over town. But it pretty much burned to the ground. That was the end of the boathouse. Well, in my high school, several of the teachers really promoted Pomona College. They really liked the idea of Pomona, and I applied a number of different places, and I was accepted everywhere, but there was a great push to go to Pomona. Actually, 7 of us from my class went to Pomona from Newport Harbor, and it was a good choice. I had a good education there and had a good time there. I was in a fraternity, and we had a lot of fun in the fraternity, and Pomona was located close to the mountains, and it was a ski resort at Mount Baldy's, half an hour away from the campus, and that changed my life a lot. I learned to ski while I was there, and I've been skiing ever since. But it was a good choice. I was a math major at Pomona, and can't tell you why exactly, because I didn't pursue mathematics after I got out of school. I loved the faculty, the math faculty. The teachers were great, and I got along with them. And so anyway, it was fine. I lived on the campus at Pomona in a wonderful dorm called Clark Hall, which is still there. Beautiful Spanish architecture, really a nice place. Big, beautiful dining hall. It was a nice place to live. I swam there on the swimming team. We won the conference all 4 years I was there. And a lot of good friends there. Still have good friends that I knew at college. We were in the conference swimming meet my senior year, which was held at Caltech. And we were the conference champions in the 50-yard freestyle, the 100-yard freestyle, and the 4-man relay, and we won the conference championship. I was just out of college looking for a job, and they asked me if I could maybe take a month off and go on a trip to Mexico with them on a hiding, and I said, yeah, I probably could do that. And it was a lot of fun. And I was about 50 years younger than the youngest of my dad's friends. But we just had a great time. I went to work, and I worked in various aerospace jobs, and 5-6 years after college, I started going to night school at Long Beach State. And I went for years and years to night school, because night school you only take 1 or 2 classes at a time, so I went for a long time to get my master's. I got a master's in business, an MBA, and especially in finance. In the 50s and 60s, it was in vogue for big companies to diversify. That was really cool, to diversify. And so Ford diversified into the aerospace business by buying a little company called Aeroneutronic Systems, which was located in Glendale. But then they succeeded in negotiating with the Irvine Company and got a great big chunk of land down here in Newport Beach, corner of Jamboree and Ford Road, and they moved the campus down there and started building buildings and started hiring people and expanding and getting more contracts. And so by the 60s, 1962 or 3, there were about 1,500 people up there. It was really a large enterprise, had a lot of employees. In fact, I think at that time they became the biggest employer in Newport Beach in the mid-60s. So anyway, the company stayed there, and they continued in the aerospace business, which was very nice for me, because I was able to get a job there and work very close to home. I wanted to live in Newport Beach, so it was very convenient. And I started there as an engineer, and then I worked my way into project management. In the last 20-some years that I was there a total of about 30 years. And about the last 20, 25 of that, I was a program manager, mostly in high-tech engineering programs and development programs. A lot of it was highly classified, so I can't talk about it. I can't remember it anyway. But it was a great place to work. We had a great technical team there. We could do just about anything. It was wonderful. Mostly I had fairly small projects that were researchy kinds of things, and just had a few engineers working on them. And then one of the things I did, I was the program manager for the trainer for the Shillelagh missile. And then I was a program manager for a lot of simulators that we built to simulate potential enemy systems, so that we could fly our airplanes against the air defense systems, things like that. So then in 1990, Ford, by that time it had evolved into being called Ford Aerospace, but it was still the Aeroneutronic division of Ford Aerospace. And in 1990, Ford sold the whole aerospace division to L'Oreal Aerospace. And simultaneous with that event, Seymour Beek retired, which it turned out was a very good decision, because L'Oreal broke the company up, sent people hither and yon. I don't know where I would have ended up, probably someplace in Kansas. So it was good that I retired at that time. Well, a classmate of mine at Pomona College, who I met during the first few days I was there, his name is Hoyle Schweitzer. And he and I had a lot in common. We wanted to learn to surf, which we did, and we wanted to learn to ski, which we did. And so we surfed a lot together, we skied a lot together. Later in life, Hoyle Schweitzer invented the windsurfer, the whole concept of standing up, holding onto a boom, and sailing a boat. He shared that invention with me later on. I became his Newport Beach dealer for windsurfers, and I taught lessons in windsurfing and one thing and another for a few years. The windsurfer was a standard one-design boat, like a lacer. I mean, it had class rules and sailed it like dinghies. But then there was this cutting-edge stuff where people started jumping waves with windsurfers, and so there was an evolution in the hardware. The boards became shorter, and the sails became higher tech, and the center of that really in the beginning was Maui. And Hoyle Schweitzer bought a house in Maui, right on the water, and that for a while was sort of the center of all of this new activity having to do with the generic term is really sailboarding, and windsurfer is a trade name. So I went over there a number of times and stayed with Hoyle, and we surfed out in the Pailolo Channel, which is the body of water between Maui and Molokai. We also sailed across that channel several times to Molokai, which was pretty exciting. You go very fast and lots of big waves. And one time I went over there with Hoyle and a group, and including my son Clark. We got about halfway across. Hoyle said, "I don't like this. There's not enough wind. I don't think we ought to go on across. I'm going to go back. You guys go on if you want, but I'm going to go back." So Hoyle and a couple other people turned around and went back. Clark and I went on over to Molokai. Well, Hoyle was right. The wind died, and we couldn't get back. Well, there was more to the story. When Clark and I got over there, we stashed our boards and sails in the bushes, and we walked up to the road, which is fairly close to the beach where we came in. And it's just, I think it's a dirt road, or was then anyway. And we thought, well, we'll hitchhike, try to get down to Kaunakakai, which is a little town about 5 miles away. Well, a car came along, and it was some people from Texas. And here we are in bathing suits with our harnesses with the hooks on them, you know, so we could sail. And we waved them down, and they said, "What are you doing?" You know, we said, "Well, we sailed over from that other." They, "What?" We said, "Well, we just need a ride. We want to go down to the town." Well, okay. So they took us down to the town, and there's one motel in the town, which was full because they were having a high school reunion or something. So we went over to the general store and figured, well, we'll get some beach towels. We'll sleep on the beach, and because it's warm. And so we got some food, got some towels and stuff. And in the meantime, I'd called over to Hoyle's house and told my wife that I wasn't going to be home that night. And I got a credit card number from her, which I wrote down. So when I went to check out from this store, I said, "I don't have my credit card, but I got my credit card number so I could charge to it." She said, "No, we don't take credit cards." And I said, "Well, I don't have any money." She said, "We'd open a charge account." I thought that was so cool. So I opened a charge account, and I paid the bill after I got home, and I also sent her a very nice gift. Anyway, somebody in that store then introduced us to the guy that we spent the night with. It turns out he knew Hoyle Schweitzer, and he knew all about, he was a sailboarder himself, so, and he had a kid about Clark's age, so it was just great. We lucked out. And the wind came up the next day, and we were able to sail back, but it was quite an adventure, especially for Clark, who was only 15 years old at the time. Well, I made 3 attempts to climb Mount Whitney, and the first was with my parents and my brother Alan in 1948. And I planned the whole trip. I had everybody's packs ready to go and their sleeping bags and the whole thing. I was really into it. And then when we got up there, I got altitude sickness and I didn't make it to the top, but my brother Alan did. So my next attempt was with my wife at that time, Jean, and another couple, and Don and Andy Lingle, actually. And we went up, and Don and I were successful. We went to the top of the peak, and that was probably 1959 or something like that. And so I stayed away from Mount Whitney for a long time. And then to celebrate my 70th birthday, my son Jim and I climbed Mount Whitney, and we couldn't get a permit to camp up there. They rationed out the permits. So we had to do it as a day hike. We had to do up and back all in one day, and that is strenuous. It's from about 8,000 feet to almost 15,000 feet, and it's about, I think it's about 11 miles. So it's a strenuous day. We started at 3 in the morning and got back down to the car about 5 in the afternoon, and we were tired. My mom and dad decided that they'd buy tickets for the last passage of the Queen Mary from England to Long Beach. And so they did. They took the trip. Well, they were a little disappointed, I think, in the trip because they didn't get to see land very much. They were way out at sea, and the Queen Mary was getting to be a little bit run down by that time because they weren't keeping it quite up to snuff. And in fact, one engine wasn't functioning, so it was dragging in one propeller the whole way, so it didn't go as fast as they would normally go. When it got here, my whole family got aboard my dad's yacht, the Vamos, to go out and greet them. And we intercepted them out here probably about 5 miles offshore. And there was no problem to see them coming because they made a huge amount of smoke. I mean, it was really smoky, so we knew exactly where they were. So we went out and we got right in their path. We were in their path so much they blew the whistle at us to get out of the way. And so we got out of the way, but it came by. We were only maybe 100 feet away from the boat, and we saw my parents. They were up on one of the upper decks and waving to us. And they told us afterwards that our 56-foot Vamos looked like a toy down there. Well, we had a lot of fun with that boat of my dad's, the Vamos. You know, he probably took 100 trips to Catalina on it. And went up and down the coast of San Francisco a dozen times with it. Cruised all around the Delta. My brother took it up to Tamales Bay. And of course, my dad took a number of trips to Mexico. I went to Guadalupe Island with him on it. And he went down to Magdalena Bay a couple of times, and he went clear down to Puerto Vallarta with it one time. That's maiden voyage, I guess. So it got a lot of use. We had a lot of fun with it. Well, my mother was active in lots of things around here after we were growing up. When we were growing up, she was a stay-at-home mom, and her first job, she felt, was to take care of us. So she wasn't active in very many things. But later she joined the Assistance League, and when Hoag Hospital was founded here, she became very active at Hoag. In fact, she held the record. At the time she died, she had more volunteer hours than any other person at Hoag, which is a kind of funny little factoid. But she was active in lots of things around here. She was with Marshall Duffield on the freeway fighters to help kill the freeway through town, and a lot of things like that she did. Where the Beek Center and the Balboa Island Park are now, there was at one time a building and a parking lot. And then that building got torn down and a church was built there, a Methodist church. It was founded by Harry White. And then eventually that church moved to Corona del Mar, and the city bought that building, and I believe they used it for storage for a while. And then eventually that building was torn down and the Balboa Island Park was created, and the building on the park was named for my mother, for Carol Beek. It became the Carol Beek Center. And that was, I'm going to say, that was in the early 80s. It was after her death, so it was probably 82, 83, 84, along in there. Well, my first two kids, with my first wife, who was a hometown girl of hers named Jean Castendike, and I had kids Tom and David with her. And then later, I remarried and had another son named Clark. And then remarried again and had two more kids named Jim and Cynthia. And they're all doing well. I'm in touch with all of them, close touch with all of them. They were all in attendance at Cynthia's wedding. And we had the ceremony, it was on the ferry boat, and then the ferry boat landed at the fun zone. So the reception was at the Fun Zone, which was a great venue. It was just wonderful, and we were lucky we had warm weather. And it was a fun time because all of my kids were there, all 5 of them, and the first time they've been together for probably 25 years, that they were all together at once. And my brother Barton's 5 kids were all there too, with their spouses. So it was really a neat family get-together, a lot of fun. I have 6 grandkids, and unfortunately, some of them live a long way away. I have one that lives in Washington State, and 2 that are up in the Bay Area in Mill Valley, and then 2 in Santa Barbara. And my oldest granddaughter, Riley, lives here in Newport Beach. And so I don't see him as much as I'd like to, but I do get to see him. Well, I met my partner, Bobby Daniel, through our children. She had 2 daughters, and they're just a little older than my 2 youngest kids, Cynthia and Jim. And they were all in the BIYC together, and they played and sailed and did all the things kids do on Balboa Island in the summer together. Humphrey Bogart was an active sailor at the Newport Harbor Yacht Club when I was a kid, and so I used to see him there quite often. He was married to Lauren Bacall, and she was quite glamorous, and they sailed dinghies together. He was a pretty good sailor. They also sailed an albatross, I believe, and of course he had a big boat called the Santana, which is a 50-some foot yawl that he raced and cruised. So that's my closest encounter with anybody, I guess. I used to see him out on the race course. Actually, I raced against him a few times. I can't remember when I got my first ride in a sailboat, but it probably with my brothers when I was very little, because I wanted to crew for my brother when I was really much too young to do that. But finally I got the job, and I was 6 years old. I became Barton's regular crew, crewed for him all summer in his snowbird. And that's how I learned to sail, because I got to sail home after the races. I'd sail the boat home, and he taught me. So by the end of that summer, I was a capable sailor. I could sail by myself, and I actually sailed in a race when I was 6. And the next summer, when I was 7, I got the award for the youngest skipper in the flight of the Snowbirds, which I sailed solo. The Flight of the Snowbirds was organized about 1936, I believe. Everybody was invited. Anybody could sail in it. Didn't have to be a member of a yacht club or anything, and all ages could sail in it. Most snowbird races were you were limited to 15 years old, and you had to get out of the class. But the Flight of the Snowbirds, everybody could sail, and so it was a big, spectacular event. Got a lot of publicity, and it was kind of a, from a yachtsman standpoint, it was kind of a mess because a lot of people broke the rules, and there were all kinds of infractions, but still it got publicity, and the winner was recognized. It was always his picture in the paper and so on. So it was kind of a big deal to the kids. So I sailed a whole lot of different things during my life. I sailed Lehman 10 dinghies and Lehman 12 dinghies. I owned a Lehman 12 for years. I sailed a Lido 14 for a while, and then my family bought a Star. My brother Bart always said it was his Star, but I thought it was our Star, and that was in 1950. And so I began to race a Star in 1950 or 51, and then subsequently, and my brother, of course, was an avid Star sailor. He sailed Stars right up until his death, practically. And but I sailed my own boat throughout the 50s and 60s, and had various crews. But my most regular crew was Raleigh Pulaski, and Raleigh and I sailed in many events, and with mixed success. We did very well, and we won some regattas. And we qualified for the Olympic trials in 1968, and we actually sailed in the Olympic trials at San Diego in 1968. And just loved sailing, just kept doing it on and on. So I really had a good life growing up. You know, I was introduced to the Bay at an early age. I lived in a wonderful place. I was really spoiled.